It all started on a Monday morning. I remember because I was rushing to work, running late as usual. The subway was packed, and I was caught in that typical New York chaos, people shouting, a kid crying, someone arguing with a ticket machine. I didn't notice the two men in uniforms until they stepped in front of me. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one of them said, his tone flat but firm. "What? Why?" I asked, confused. "We've had reports of erratic behavior," the other said, stepping closer. "We just need to evaluate you." "Erratic?" I laughed nervously. "I'm on my way to work." "You've got the wrong guy." But they weren't listening. Before I could react, one of them grabbed my arm. "Let go!" I shouted, but the crowd was too busy to care. People glanced at me and then quickly looked away. I tried pulling free, but they were stronger than they looked. In minutes, I was shoved into the back of an unmarked van, the doors slamming shut behind me. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice rising. "I haven't done anything." They didn't answer. The van drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. I couldn't see where we were going, the windows were blacked out, and the men ignored every question I asked. When we finally stopped, they pulled me out and escorted me into a tall, gray building surrounded by a rusted iron fence. The sign at the entrance read, "New York Psychiatric Hospital." They led me into a sterile, white room with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. A woman in scrubs sat behind a desk, typing on an old computer. "Name?" she asked, not looking up. "Are you kidding me?" I said, my voice shaking. "This is a mistake. I don't belong here." "Name," she repeated, her tone cold and mechanical. "Andrew," I said reluctantly. "Andrew Grant." She typed for a moment, then handed a clipboard to the men who brought me in. "Room 317, she said. They dragged me down a long hallway lined with metal doors, each with a small, square window. From behind some of the doors, I could hear muffled screams, laughter, or worse, silence. "This is insane," I said, panic rising. "I'm not supposed to be here." They ignored me, shoving me into a small room with a single bed, a chair, and a table bolted to the floor. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the tiny space. For a while, I just sat there, stunned. It didn't make sense. I wasn't crazy. I didn't belong in a place like this. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became, if I couldn't convince them to let me go, no one would believe I wasn't supposed to be here. I had to prove my sanity. The next day, they brought me to the common area, a large, open space filled with mismatched furniture and a handful of other patients. Most of them kept to themselves, staring blankly at the walls or muttering under their breath. Except for one man. He was older, with thin gray hair and a crooked smile. He sat down across from me and leaned in close. "They're watching you," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. I didn't respond. "They watch all of us," he continued. "Through the cameras. Through the vents. Even when you think you're alone, you're not." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that no one was watching, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Because deep down, I wasn't so sure. Over the next few days, I started noticing things. The orderlies always seemed to know where you were, even if you hadn't seen them. The food trays were all the same, but sometimes mine tasted off. Bitter. And then there was the notebook. I found it tucked under the mattress on my second night. It was small, with a black leather cover and blank pages inside. I started writing in it almost immediately. I wrote about the intake process, the other patients, and the strange feeling I couldn't shake, that this place wasn't just a hospital. It was something else. The more I observed, the more I realized how wrong everything felt. The lights in the hallways flickered constantly, and the air always smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic. The patients weren't just sick, they were broken. I saw a woman sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth, muttering numbers under her breath. I saw a man standing perfectly still in the middle of the common area, staring at the clock for hours without blinking. And then there was the screaming. Every night, without fail, someone would start screaming. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect from a bad dream or a tantrum. It was raw, primal, like an animal in pain. The first time I heard it, I ran to the door and pounded on it, shouting for someone to tell me what was going on. No one answered. Eventually, I asked one of the nurses about it. "Who's screaming at night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She smiled at me, but her eyes were cold. "You shouldn't concern yourself with things like that." "What's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer. On the fifth night, the screams came again. But this time, they didn't stop. It went on for hours, echoing through the halls, until I couldn't take it anymore. I started pounding on the walls, shouting for someone to make it stop. And then, abruptly, the screaming cut off. A moment later, my door opened. 2 orderlies stood there, their faces blank. "It's your turn," one of them said. I froze in place, staring at the 2 orderlies standing in my doorway. "My turn for what?" I asked, my voice barely audible. They didn't answer. One of them stepped forward, grabbing my arm. His grip was like iron, and before I could pull away, he yanked me to my feet. "You're making a mistake," I stammered. "I don't belong here. I'm not crazy." But they didn't care. They dragged me out into the hallway, their footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. I twisted and shouted, trying to free myself, but it was useless. They were stronger than I was, and no one was coming to help. As we passed the other rooms, I caught glimpses of the patients inside. Some stared at me through the small windows, their faces blank. Others pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with fear. No one said a word. They brought me to a room at the end of the hallway, a cold, sterile space with a single chair bolted to the floor. A nurse was waiting for us, her face calm and expressionless. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You've been selected for observation," she replied. I hesitated, but the orderlies shoved me into the chair, strapping my arms and legs down before I could resist. The nurse approached me, holding a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "No," I said, shaking my head. "You can't do this. I'm not supposed to be here." "It'll be easier if you don't fight," she said, her tone almost bored. The needle slid into my arm, and the world began to blur. I don't remember how long I was in that room. I'd wake up and find myself staring at a bright light on the ceiling, my body heavy and unresponsive. I could hear voices, doctors, nurses, people I didn't recognize, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Sometimes, I'd feel the cold touch of a stethoscope against my chest or the sharp sting of another needle. Other times, I'd hear the screams again. Not just one voice this time, but many, layers of agony blending together until I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. When I finally woke up, I was back in my room. My head throbbed, and my limbs felt weak, like I'd been running a marathon in my sleep. I sat up slowly, my heart racing as fragments of the observation room flashed through my mind. On the table was my notebook. I grabbed it, flipping through the pages frantically. The last thing I'd written was still there, but below it was something new. A single sentence, written in shaky, unfamiliar handwriting. "They're watching you." That day, I learned about the rules. One of the patients, a wiry man named Reggie, sat down next to me in the common area. "First time in the chair?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, too tired to argue. "You'll get used to it," he said, grinning. "We all do." "What do they want from us?" I asked. "Data," he said simply. "Data?" He nodded, leaning closer. They're running experiments. Watching how we react to certain things. What things? Reggie's grin faded. You'll see. Over the next few days, I started to notice the patterns. The nurses always walked the halls in pairs, their faces expressionless. The orderlies never spoke unless they were giving orders. And then there were the patients. Some were quiet, like me, trying to keep their heads down and avoid attention. Others played along, laughing and chatting like they didn't have a care in the world. But there was a third group, people who didn't speak at all. They were the ones who sat in the corners, staring at nothing, their eyes hollow. They've been broken, Reggie explained one day, nodding toward one of them. The chair does that sometimes. On my 7th night, the screams came again. But this time, I didn't pound on the walls or shout for help. I just sat there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for them to stop. When they finally did, I heard something else. A faint tapping sound, coming from the wall behind me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But then it came again, 3 short taps, followed by silence. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the wall. Who's there? I whispered. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a voice, barely audible. Don't trust them. I froze, my heart racing. Who are you? I asked. The voice didn't answer. The next morning, I tried to figure out who was in the room next to mine. But when I asked one of the nurses, she just smiled and said, "You don't need to worry about that." When I pressed her, she walked away. That night, I heard the tapping again. This time, the voice was clearer. They're not what they seem, it said. Get out while you can. How? I whispered. Silence. Then, just before the tapping stopped, the voice said one last thing. Follow the screams. The voice stayed with me long after the tapping stopped. Follow the screams. What did that mean? The screams were everywhere, constant at night and echoing faintly during the day. How was I supposed to follow them? The next morning, I sat in the common area, my notebook open on the table in front of me. I wasn't writing this time, just staring at the blank pages, trying to make sense of the message. Reggie slid into the chair across from me, his crooked grin firmly in place. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said. Have you ever heard tapping through the walls? I asked quietly. Reggie's grin faded. He glanced over his shoulder, then leaned in closer. Don't talk about that. Why not? Because they'll hear you, he hissed, his eyes darting toward the nearest nurse. I wanted to press him, but something about his expression stopped me. Instead, I nodded and went back to staring at my notebook, the faint metallic smell of the hospital creeping into my senses. That night, the tapping came again. This time, it was more urgent, rapid, uneven knocks, like someone was desperately trying to get my attention. Are you there? I whispered. Yes, the voice replied, barely audible through the wall. What do you want me to do? Room 314, it said. Midnight. Don't let them see you. The tapping stopped abruptly, and I was left in silence. For hours, I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. I didn't know what was in room 314, but I couldn't ignore the voice. When midnight finally came, I slipped out of bed, my movements slow and deliberate. The door to my room wasn't locked this time, something I didn't notice until now. The hallway was dark, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. I crept toward room 314, my bare feet silent against the cold floor. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The small window in the door was dark, and I couldn't see inside. I reached for the handle, but before I could touch it, the door swung open. The room was empty. At least, that's what I thought at first. The walls were lined with padded panels, and a single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak, yellowish light. In the center of the room was a chair. It wasn't like the one I'd been strapped to before. This one was larger, with thick leather restraints and a metal frame that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. And next to the chair was a small table. On the table was a tape recorder. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt heavier here, the metallic smell stronger. I picked up the recorder and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then the screaming began. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of them, men, women, even children, all blending together into a horrifying symphony of pain. I dropped the recorder, my hands shaking. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. Before I could leave, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, grabbing the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then the lights flickered, and I heard it. The tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the ceiling. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. There, behind a small, grated vent, was a pair of eyes. When the door finally opened, I was back in my room, sitting on the edge of the bed, the tape recorder clutched in my hands. I didn't remember leaving room 314. I didn't even remember walking back to my room. The next morning, I found Reggie in the common area again. "I need your help," I said, sitting down across from him. Reggie glanced around nervously. "I told you not to." "Please," I interrupted. "I need to get out of here." He hesitated, then sighed. "You're not the first to ask me that. And they never made it." "What do you mean?" Reggie leaned closer, lowering his voice. "This place isn't what you think it is. It's not just a hospital." "Then what is it?" I asked. "They're watching us," he said. "Studying us. They want to see how far they can push us before we break." I wanted to tell him he was crazy, but after what I'd seen in room 314, I couldn't. "Do you know a way out?" I asked. Reggie nodded slowly. "There's a door in the basement. They use it for deliveries. But it's locked. Always locked." "Then how do we open it?" Reggie's grin returned, but this time, it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll need a keycard," he said. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the tapping again. This time, the voice said something new. "Find the doctor." "Why?" I whispered. "He has the key." The voice didn't come back after that. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Find the doctor. He has the key. Which doctor? There were at least 3 that I'd seen, none of them friendly, all of them distant. The kind of people who didn't see patients as human beings, just numbers and experiments. When morning came, I decided to talk to Reggie again. "Do you know which doctor has the key?" I asked him in the common area. Reggie glanced over his shoulder, his expression wary. "You're asking for trouble," he said. "I don't have a choice," I replied. "If I stay here, I'll end up like the others." Reggie hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Dr. Kessler," he whispered. "He's the one in charge of, whatever this is." "What does he look like?" Reggie's voice dropped even lower. "You'll know him when you see him. Tall guy. Always wearing gloves. And he doesn't smile." Dr. Kessler didn't show up until late that afternoon. I spotted him during one of the therapy sessions, mandatory gatherings where patients sat in a circle and talked about their feelings while a nurse watched like a hawk. He walked into the room like he owned the place, his presence sending a ripple of unease through the patients. He didn't say a word, just stood in the corner, his gloved hands folded in front of him. I watched him closely, trying to figure out how I could get close enough to take the keycard without him noticing. That night, the voice came back. "Tomorrow," it said. "When he's alone." "How do you know?" I whispered. The tapping stopped. The next day, I skipped breakfast and stayed in my room, waiting for the right moment. I watched from the small window in my door as Dr. Kessler made his rounds, moving from patient to patient with a cold, detached efficiency. When he finally disappeared down the hallway toward his office, I knew it was time. Reggie had told me where the office was, a small room near the end of the north wing. Be careful, he'd warned. That's where they keep the files. And the cameras. I slipped out of my room when the hallway was clear, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. My heart was pounding, every step feeling like a gamble. When I reached the office, I pressed my ear to the door. I could hear him inside, the faint sound of papers shuffling. I waited. Minutes passed, then silence. Finally, the door opened, and Dr. Kessler stepped out, heading down the hallway toward another patient's room. The office was empty. The room was smaller than I expected, cluttered with files, medical charts, and old equipment. On the desk was a stack of folders, each labeled with a patient's name. I scanned them quickly, my stomach twisting as I read the names. Reggie Morris. Sarah Conway. Mark Little. Andrew Grant. My name. I grabbed the folder and opened it, my hands shaking. Inside were pages of notes, observations about my behavior, my reactions, and my time in the chair. There were even photos. One of me sitting in the common area. Another of me in my room, staring at the wall. And the last one, me lying in the chair in the observation room, my eyes closed, with Dr. Kessler standing over me. Before I could process it, I heard footsteps. I froze, clutching the folder, as the sound grew louder. "Who's in there?" a voice barked. It wasn't Kessler. It was an orderly. I shoved the folder back onto the desk and ducked behind a filing cabinet, holding my breath as the door opened. The orderly stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. For a moment, he stood still, scanning the room. Then, slowly, he walked toward the desk. I stayed perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. The orderly picked up a few papers, muttered something under his breath, and left, slamming the door behind him. I waited a few seconds before stepping out from my hiding spot. On the desk, I saw it. The keycard. That night, I showed Reggie the card. "You actually did it," he said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. "I need to get to the basement," I said. Reggie shook his head. "You're crazy. If they catch you down there." "They won't," I interrupted. "Are you coming or not?" He hesitated, then nodded. We waited until the night shift began, when most of the nurses were busy with the patients. The entrance to the basement was near the east wing, behind a heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." I slid the keycard through the reader, and the door unlocked with a loud click. The staircase beyond the door was dark and steep, the air growing colder with every step we took. "Stay close," I whispered to Reggie. At the bottom of the stairs, we found another door. This one wasn't locked. We stepped inside and froze. The basement was huge, filled with rows of metal gurneys and strange machines that hummed faintly. On the far wall, I saw what looked like a surgical station, bright lights, sharp tools, and restraints. But it was what was behind the station that made my blood run cold. It was a wall of cages. Each one was filled with a patient. They weren't screaming. They weren't moving. They just stared at us, their eyes wide and hollow, their mouths slightly open as if they were trying to speak but couldn't. And in the cage closest to us was the man from the tapping. He looked at me, his lips trembling, and whispered one word. "Run." The man in the cage stared at me, his eyes wide and desperate. "Run," he whispered again, his voice trembling. I took a step back, my heart pounding as I tried to process what I was seeing. The patients in the cages, if you could still call them patients, weren't just restrained. They looked altered. Their faces were pale, their movements sluggish, and their eyes hollow, as if whatever made them human had been stripped away. Andrew, Reggie whispered, grabbing my arm. We have to go. But I couldn't move. In the cage next to the man was a woman I recognized, Sarah Conway, the name from the file on Dr. Kessler's desk. Her eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. Then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was wide and unnatural, her lips stretching too far, her teeth bared in a way that made my stomach churn. Run, she whispered, mimicking the man's voice. Andrew. Reggie hissed, yanking me toward the door. Finally, I snapped out of it. As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us. A loud, piercing alarm filled the room, echoing off the concrete walls. Shit, Reggie muttered, his eyes darting around. They know we're here. I looked back at the cages. The patients were all moving now, their hands gripping the bars, their faces pressed against the metal. Run, they all said in unison, their voices blending into a low, guttural chant. We bolted toward the stairs, the alarm still blaring. The door at the top of the stairs burst open, and 2 orderlies appeared, blocking our path. Get back here, one of them shouted, lunging toward us. Reggie grabbed a loose pipe from the floor and swung it, the metal connecting with the orderly's arm. Go, he shouted at me. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted down a narrow hallway, my breath ragged as I tried to find another way out. Behind me, I could hear Reggie fighting the orderlies, the sound of shouting and metal clanging echoing in the distance. I turned a corner and found myself in another room. It was small and cluttered, filled with filing cabinets and boxes stacked haphazardly. One of the boxes was open, its contents spilled across the floor. I crouched down, picking up a photograph. It was of a patient strapped to the chair in the observation room. There were more photos, images of surgeries, injections, and strange machines hooked up to unconscious patients. On one of the photos, someone had written a single word. Success. I shoved the photos into my pocket and kept moving. The hallway grew darker, the air colder, until I reached another door. This one wasn't locked. The room beyond was larger than the others, its walls lined with surgical tools and medical equipment. In the center was a table, its restraints smeared with something dark and dried. And standing next to the table was Dr. Kessler. He didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, he looked amused. Mr. Grant, he said calmly, pulling off his gloves. I was wondering how long it would take you to find this place. I backed away, my heart pounding. What is this? What are you doing to these people? He tilted his head, studying me like I was an insect under a microscope. They're not people, he said finally. Not anymore. What the hell are you talking about? They're subjects, he said. Volunteers, in a way. We're pushing the boundaries of the human mind. Seeing what it can endure. What it can become. You're insane, I spat. He smiled faintly. Am I? Or am I simply ahead of my time? Before I could respond, he stepped toward me, pulling a syringe from his pocket. Don't fight it, Mr. Grant, he said. You'll understand soon enough. I grabbed the nearest object, a tray of surgical tools, and swung it at him. The tray hit his arm, and the syringe clattered to the floor. He lunged at me, his face twisted with anger. We struggled, his hands clawing at my shirt as I tried to push him away. My hand found a scalpel on the tray, and I swung it blindly. Kessler staggered back, blood dripping from a gash on his arm. You'll regret that, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. I didn't wait for him to recover. I ran. I burst through another door and found myself in the delivery area Reggie had mentioned. The large metal door at the far end was open, the night air pouring in. I sprinted toward it, my legs screaming in protest, and didn't stop until I was outside. The parking lot was empty, but I didn't care. I ran until I found a road, waving down the first car I saw. The driver, a middle-aged woman, stared at me in shock as I pounded on her window. "Please," I begged. "I need help." She unlocked the door, and I climbed in, gasping for breath. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll explain later," I said. "Just drive." The police didn't believe me. When they went to New York Psychiatric Hospital, they found nothing. No cages, no files, no Dr. Kessler. The hospital was empty. They told me it had been closed for years. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. The tapping. And the voice whispering through the walls. They're still watching. Have you ever been in a situation where no one believed you? What did you do?